what is you think is the biggest what if um, in basketball history? Now, it could be just personal to you, or I'm curious if you're going to take the more the college route, just
Mm,
because there's been a lot more heartbreak. But I'm curious just to see where you take this in terms of kind of the biggest what if moment in your mind, just in basketball history.
mm. This one is so tough. I think my personal one that I would elevate above the rest, and I have a couple that come to mind, but my personal one is, what if the decision doesn't happen? How
Mm.
different do the 2010s and this modern era of basketball look? How different is the conversation around LeBron James? Like, what if he has two titles or three titles instead of the four that he has, but they're all in Cleveland? Like,
Welcome to another edition of Hoopsology's In the Lab. I am Justin Goodrum, joined by Matt Thomas. What's up, man?
hey, Justin, doing well. Another solid week, kind of biding our time until the NBA season kicks off. WNBA season is back in full swing again after the Olympic breaks. So yeah, just enjoying kind of this quiet time. Football is all the rage right now in the sports world since that has kicked off, at least on the college side. How are things for you?
Yeah, things are good. And things are very fiery, like you mentioned, with the WNBA. Plenty of controversy going down there. Like you said, football's kicking off in a couple of days. So lots to talk about within the sports world. Usually this is our off season, but we've had plenty of content, plenty of interviews. So please go check that out in our archives. You can access that through Spotify, through Apple Podcasts, or through YouTube. Just hop in there. We had a great interview with Liam Canny, a great interview with Andrew Petcash, Noah Eagle. I can just go on and on with our interviews this summer. So a big thank you to all of our guests, just getting us through the off season and getting us ready for the NBA season. And of course, our partners at Balls Life as well for hosting our show.
Shout
So
out.
a little bit of a different in the lab. You might be used to hearing Matt's voice hosting this version of the show, but since we are doing a series where we're interviewing each other, you might have seen our archives where Matt interviewed myself. Now it's my turn to turn the tables on Matt and interview him. So I just want to ask you, are you ready for this? Because I know I hate being interviewed. I'm usually super awkward. So I don't know if you feel the same way. I'm sure you're will do better than I did. So
Yeah, I studied the game film. I took my notes. I think I'm ready to be in the hot seat, as I called it when when you were in it last time
right.
around. So fair is fair. I got to spend my time here.
So let's hop into it. And like you mentioned, Matt, we have a tradition here. And I think before doing this series, we haven't delved into ourselves, our origin story. And this is a question we ask all of our guests. So, what is your first basketball memory?
So I think, like many kids in America anyway, and probably around the world these days, with basketball being a global sport, as we've been talking about on the show recently, I think my first tactile experience with basketball was, like many children, Fisher Price basketball hoop.
Mhm.
I'm sure you probably remember those,
Oh,
Justin.
yeah.
Maybe had one as well. I know got one for my son when he was able to walk around. So just something special about that. And then doing trick shots from around the house. Also, dueling with my friends on doorway basketball rim setups, breaking many of those, especially the plastic ones. But then I wrote down a couple of other first memories too. One that really stands out, that was my first experience, I think, of more elite level basketball, was when I was really young. I want to say I was about 5 or 6 years old. And my family was down in El Paso. My dad took me to a UTEP Miners basketball game.
Oh, cool.
So University of Texas, El Paso. And I just remember that being a really eye-opening experience. Just that this is what good basketball looks like. I mean, I know UTEP wasn't blowing anyone's doors off at that time, uh, but it was cool to see like collegiate level athletes like that. And I just remember how fast they were, how competent they were. I couldn't have verbalized that at the time, but it was an eye-opening experience. I also remember we lived in California for a stretch when I was young after we had lived in Texas. And we went to a local high school basketball game in California. I had two very small schools. I couldn't even tell you the name of the schools right now, but we lived in a small town in California. So not a big deal. There weren't NBA prospects like there are in some parts of California. But I remember the passion of the game because it was a rivalry game. I remember being in that high school gym and feeling like the walls were shaking just with how into it everyone was. And I had no allegiance to either school. I was just experiencing this. And one of the first like very passionate sports moments I remember experiencing. And I just thought that was really cool. And then last one, my first NBA memory, my first time going to an NBA game, I got to see the Charles Barkley Phoenix Suns play against the Mitch Richmond Sacramento Kings in Sacramento at Arco Arena. That was really cool. To kind of show you the innocence of my childhood at the time with that experience. I went into the game rooting for Sacramento because that's the California team. But then my friend explained to me that, well, the Suns had come to us all the way from Phoenix, so he wanted them to win. And then I was kind of like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. They traveled all this way. We should root for the Suns. Wound up buying like a Suns hat, one of the cool retro like 90s Suns logos back then, this sweet purple and orange hat. I wish I still had that hat, but there's a handful of first memories.
Yeah, right on. What is your favorite basketball memory? A lot to choose from. Just a little disclosure: Matt and I went to middle school with each other. That's where we first met. You played on the middle school team there, so just wondering what's gonna factor in. Is it kind of a personal experience or something that you watched on TV or observed or something else?
I'll give you both. Have to mention, even though the Bulls aren't my team, I rooted for the Bulls quite a bit in the 90s because Jordan was awesome. I mean, Jordan, as you talked about in parts of your interview, I mean, he was such an icon of the 90s. And just you can't really talk about the 90s without at least mentioning Michael Jordan in a part of that. And the last shot, to end that playoff series against Utah, to shut the door on that, just iconic. I remember watching it in the moment. Is incredible. I mean, it may be the climax of the NBA. We'll see what happens as time goes on. But there were like, I think 38 million plus viewers on that. Just an iconic moment in sports overall, let alone basketball. And it was compelling to watch. It was amazing. The other thing you mentioned, my middle school playing days. So I'll give you a short story from that. I think it was our first game of the season. We were playing at Eisenhower here in lovely Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we were getting routed, as was the case a lot that season. We did not have a great season, as you remember, our 8th grade year there, unfortunately. I was a reserve. I was not a stellar basketball player. So I get like 6 minutes a game that I get to play. That's like my playing time that season. I come in and I get the ball passed to me on the baseline, which was like my shot growing up as a kid. And I just, in a panic, pure adrenaline taking over, I must have shot it like this, like thumbs down, almost like a chest pass for those of you on audio, towards the basket. I mean, poor shooting form. And I could at least hit a jump shot here and there, but I was panicked. Anyway, stroke of luck, swishes. Coach, at the end of the game, after everything is all said and done, Coach was intense in 8th grade, and he was chewing us out about our performance that game and how we just got decimated. And then he says at the end of his speech, the only one who went out there and showed me something today, let's give a hand to Matt.
Oh my
And like,
god.
and so I'm
Oh
embarrassed
no.
because like the starters are not happy, the actual players with talent are not happy, and they're being forced by our coach to like give me a round of applause for making a
Oh
lucky
man.
jump shot.
Ugh,
But it was pretty awesome in the moment. And very,
I
very
bet.
lucky, as I said.
Was that road or away? Was that at Grant or you
That
said
was
at
road. We were
road
at
at Eisenhower?
Eisenhower.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't a menacing road experience like many basketball players have experienced, but it was enough that we were a little out of our comfort zone, and it was made a lot worse that I think we lost by like 30 points maybe.
Oh my goodness. Uh, it's interesting how coaches take things so serious when I mean it's middle school basketball. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
we got chewed out a lot that season.
yeah, geez. I have to see. My dad taught at Grant Middle School, and I don't think he remembers the coach at all. So I think I was a reserve on the sixth grade team, and then I quit afterwards. But I didn't get it. He did
Mm.
better than me. Um, so let's move on and let's talk about like your favorite teams. So I know you kind of switched allegiances over the years. Your basketball tastes have changed.
Yeah.
So let's kind of hop into kind of your favorite teams. Um, because I'm probably going to have more of a, I guess, a eclectic selection. I'm way more biased. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious to see kind of where your teams rank in terms of like your favorite teams, historic, current, so on. So
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's interesting growing up in Albuquerque. You have basically free pick, kind of whatever grabs you,
yeah,
when you are of age to get into sports. So I've always, even since childhood, like if I want to pick a team that's going to do well, like if I have my choice for the NBA, I would pick the Houston Rockets. Main thing there is family ties. I did love the Elijah Rockets, was pretty young when they were doing their back to back in the 90s between Jordan's three-peat. But I was old enough that I really liked watching Elijah play. I remember playing one of my favorite Super Nintendo games. I think is like NBA Showdown, I'm pretty sure, where you could like hit threes with Elijah. It was really kind of weird. I mean, he was a great jump shooter for the time, but wasn't knocking down threes on a regular basis. Anyway, so always have had a soft spot for the Rockets, but I'll be perfectly honest. Like I was not as big of a fan of the James Harden era as many current Rockets fans. And this is where I'm sure I would get some negativity on Twitter or whatever if I posted about this. But, if I see basketball that I don't like, which I did not enjoy all that much watching Harden, all due respect, he's an incredible offensive talent. But yeah, I was not, I mean, I was rooting for the city to do well, for my family interest and ties there, sure. But I wasn't on the edge of my seat like I was just the era shortly before that with like the mishmash Rockets and then Yao Ming and T Mac before then was one of my favorite teams to watch, even though, they did not have much postseason success. And of course, Yao had the foot injuries, those kinds of things. Um, so yeah, in terms of favorite NBA team, I'd have to say the Rockets. I've always rooted for greatness in spurts. I just like to see that. So yeah, I rooted for the Bulls to three-peat. I liked the way that they went out on top like that, like kind of storybook ending, even though, behind the scenes, as we learned in The Last Dance and as we knew well before that, there was a lot of drama that was pretty negative going on in the back end. And I'm sure angers most fans that you wouldn't keep that team together or do everything in your power to do that. I also like, the Shaq Kobe Lakers. Like I'm not a Lakers fan. I I won't sit here and be a Lakers stan and everything, but man, it's hard not to be impressed and respect what Shaq was doing in the early 2000s, how he was basically officiated different than every other player in the league at the time because he was such an unstoppable force. And then the rise of Kobe, I think, was big for people in your and my generation, kind of watching him come out of high school and seeing what was possible there. So I have to give a tip of the cap to the 2000s Lakers. Also, the only team in the modern era to three-peat, other than the Bulls, who did it twice, of course. Um, Beyond that, Uh, current teams, I like how the Rockets are built right now. I have been into watching the Rockets even through some rough seasons. Since they've moved out of the Harden era, I wanted to get back into it a little bit more, become kind of a more traditional fan with it. I like what I've seen with like Şengün and how they're building there. I like watching, the Nuggets. They're a fun watch. They're also kind of close to local for us, in the Mountain West region here. And then of course I got to mention our college team and our alma mater, the Lobos. There is a big basketball culture in Albuquerque, and I think if I could have one thing, and you might be on the same page with me here, Justin, if we could just have, I'm not even going to ask for a championship, but if we could have a Final Four trip for the Lobos, it, as well as I do, it would do so much for Albuquerque. So those are some general ideas. Lobos for college. Always had a thing for UNC because of the Michael Jordan history there, and not, for whatever reason, just not really caring much for Duke. And then Rockets in the NBA, along with some of the great dynasties I've always sort of pulled to see greatness.
No, I feel you, and I understand your pain with James Harden because I think I felt that way with Derrick Rose. I mean,
Mm,
I liked his game, but I always felt it was very individualist. I don't know, it's very just isolation, and I just knew there's like a ticking time bomb with him, and sure enough, I was right when he got hurt. So,
mm.
I feel you. It wasn't like the most enjoyable basketball. I know people really love that era, and he's from Chicago. He won the MVP and just everything, but I don't know. I just wasn't a fan. So I get what you're saying with James Harden. Um,
Yeah, I think the way things, just real quick, sorry,
yeah, no, of course,
the way things went with that Rockets team too, where it was so formulaic to watch, like
yeah.
you're either getting a layup or free throws with James Harden, and he was very good at that, or you're getting a drive and kick and you're doing a 3-pointer. We're going to do no mid range. You're like basically running laps in practice. If you shoot a mid range jumper, like I just don't like the aesthetics of that. It's not pleasing to watch. I don't, on the Celtics team, the '08 championship Celtics, I didn't like plays when it was Rondo holding the ball for 20 seconds and then passing for the last second assist. And granted, there's a lot more to it than that. And they had certainly their great moments. That was a great team, but I want to watch stuff that's pleasing to watch too. And I like the mix of things. And if things get to be a point where they feel too formulaic, which sometimes the 3-point shot feels that way, just broadly speaking. Um, Again, not saying that you should never shoot threes, but when I'm watching basketball as a consumer and someone who loves the sport, I want to see a mix of things. So I wasn't getting that from the Rockets for a while there, and it was strictly by design. And Daryl Morey wasn't hiding that either. Maybe,
No.
respect to him for not hiding it.
No, I feel you. I want to hop into kind of your most memorable players. So, in terms of just personally, star level, and then just a player that no one talks about that's special to you, that doesn't get his due.
Yeah, gosh, this this is tough. I think in some ways Olajuwon fits this mold a little bit. I feel like he is forgotten to
Agreed.
a certain level in terms of how elite he was compared to how much he's talked about. Like there's a reason players are still consulting with Hakeem Olajuwon over the offseason. Like any player who wants to improve footwork in general, or especially footwork in the post, you're still going to Hakeem Olajuwon for that all these years later. I mean, that speaks volumes right there. But I think also, given that he is in the argument and maybe is outright the greatest defensive basketball player in history, I think he's the mold. If you're building a starting five, you may consider him as your starting center. If you want to have, like, if Jordan is going to be your shooting guard, for example, you want Jordan to be taking a lot of shots. You might not want to give shots to Kareem, who I would argue is the greatest center in history. But if you're building a coherent team starting five, I think Olajuwon is my pick. And I don't think he often gets his due as far as that goes. I think there are a lot of players who are forgotten like that. I have to mention Even though I can't say I've ever been a Pistons fan, from doing our show and interviews that we've had, and specifically one with Rich Cohen, Isaiah Thomas is someone that I think, because he was vilified, because he was pitted against Jordan, it was a great thing for the sport overall. But I think he also doesn't get his due and deserves a more fair shake to be within the argument as greatest point guard of all time. And I know he doesn't have as long of a career as other point guards, and we know how injuries went for him towards the end of his career that kind of shut things down early. You have a lot of cases like that. These are some big names who I think are undersung. I have to mention, like, watching Dennis Rodman play throughout his career. Those matchups with Rodman against Karl Malone in the finals were incredible. I loved this idea of just this guy who is the rebound magnet. He's going to get every rebound. He can't shoot worth a lick, or at least in the NBA, his scoring went down quite a bit. I think he actually averaged like 25 plus points a game in college, um, but he was very, very specialized. I like, in some respects, like specialized players. Um, have to also give a shout out to Matt Bullard. I went to his basketball camp when I was a kid, and he was a little bit ahead of his time. He was a power forward on the Houston Rockets who, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 seasons, but he led the league in 3-point percentage. He's a guy who would do wonders in the modern era of the NBA. And then, like, in modern day, I love Jokic. I love Giannis. Those are some of my favorite players. Şengün on the Rockets, I think, is a really fun watch, and I'm curious to see where his ceiling will be as he develops in his career. Have to give a shout out to some Lobos players, since they are ultimately my favorite basketball team. You mentioned some of these players in our interview, so I'll just give a quick shout out. Kenny Thomas, Charles Smith, Clayton Shields, who
Yeah.
was a 3-and-D guy on that Kenny Thomas Lobos team. Felt like he would never miss a three-pointer. Same with Royce Olney, who was a guard on that team. When we were in school together, have to give a shout out to Chad Toppert, who is a three-point
Yeah.
specialist. Always felt like he was going to hit a shot. And then one of the most reliable point guards I've ever seen in a Lobos uniform, Doris Gary. Loved watching him play. Have to give a shout to Danny Granger, who's been huge for Albuquerque and the Lobos in general. Had all-star success in the NBA. You listeners who know nothing about the Lobos have probably at least heard of Danny Granger. And then I also want to say, like, just an element of fandom that has increased since I've studied back on the 2000s more, an era that I watched probably the most basketball of any era I've watched. And yet I did not in the moment have the appreciation for Kobe Bryant that I do now. Going back in and looking at what he actually accomplished during his time with Shaq, which I feel gets underrated. Like, a lot of people compare it to Batman and Robin. Really, it's more like Shaq was Superman and Kobe was Batman. I would use the Justice League
Yeah.
sort of
Agreed.
description rather than Batman Robin. I think is unfair. If you actually look at Kobe leading playoffs in like clutch time scoring, those kinds of things, Shaq was getting them to the end of games. Kobe was like shutting the door on the team. I don't think that gets said enough. And then also, arguably, the most difficult back-to-back in history. Maybe it was the Bad Boy Pistons. There's also a really good case. It was the Kobe Bryant, Pau Gasol Lakers of 2009, 2010, with the storybook ending of beating the Celtics that beat them in 2008, which is pretty cool to see. I'm not a huge Lakers fan. And at the time, I honestly didn't care for Kobe that much. But that's something that my eyes have really been open to, thanks to like channels like Scap Attack that have really done their deep dives with analytics on what Kobe actually accomplished in that. So yeah, I said a mouthful there in terms of favorite players, Justin. So I'll leave it at that.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I think agree with you with the Isaiah Thomas point. And it's crazy because I think when we were kids, really the only sport with like a massive amount of history was baseball. And so really the
Mm,
other sports like the Super Bowl. I mean, I'm not a sports historian, but not like the Super Bowl's been around since like 1910. I mean, I would say, I think the 60s, 70s ish. And then I think with basketball, I mean, the popularity of the sport really began, at least with the NBA, in the 80s. So now, fast forward, you have all this history that's happened. So, another 30 years, we're going to be remembering a big bulk of the league. And you're going to have a lot of people that, I mean, Kobe's gonna seem like a relic. So it's interesting. I think it ties into the next question, which is consumption of, I guess, basketball overall. A quick break from In the Lab to request a favor. If you love the chats with Matt and I, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video. Also, by doing that, you get all of our back interviews featuring commentators from the WNBA and the NBA, our interviews with PA announcers, and our interviews with journalists from SB Nation, NBC Sports, and The Athletic, and a lot more. Again, please subscribe. Thanks, and now back to In the Lab. Just in terms of now, with you have children. Just you're mentioning Kobe, and it's showing that the greatness of Kobe, and it's his unfortunate, just his timely, unfortunate passing that he experienced.
yeah.
Just experiencing like what he meant to the game, just through YouTube clips, compared to like my dad can only tell me stories of Larry Bird, like he couldn't really show me.
Mm.
So I'm just wondering, how are you, especially because you have children, like does that change how you consume basketball? Just because, do you want to show them highlights? Do they even care? Like, where's that go to you personally, and then just showing just kind of what meant to you the most, not only within the NBA but also the Lobos too. Does that matter to you, or that's not a part of this your basketball consumption these days?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you bring it up. They had in the NBA app um, an option where you could go back and watch past finals.
That's right. Yeah.
And I did go back and I showed, we watched like 2 games of the, um, the 95, wait, yeah, I think the 95 finals that was Rockets versus Magic. So you have the duel of Shaq and Penny versus Hakeem Olajuwon, and Olajuwon ultimately just really getting the best of Shaq and the Magic.
Mhm.
Um, so kind of cool just to be able to rewind, and you can tell the stark difference between the game then, like what spacing looked like compared to how open things are now, as we've talked about a lot in interviews with our guests and among each other. um, so there's a huge difference in how things look. There are certain things I'll share that children really gravitate towards. And one of these things that I heard about a lot when Steph Curry was blowing up, but then saw instantly with my son. I mean, to this day, if the Warriors are on, in spite of me never nudging my son towards rooting for the Warriors, he's rooting for the Warriors, and it's because he loves Steph Curry. Like he loves seeing his ability to pull up from seemingly anywhere on the court and score like that. I think there's just a real simple, uh, real understanding of what's going on there and how impressive it is to have that kind of shooting ability that translates easily to kids' understanding of the sport too. Whereas some of the more like nuanced things like reading passes, those kinds of things, I don't know if my son appreciates, although he likes Jokic, I don't know if he actually appreciates and understands what Jokic is doing compared to looking at what Steph Curry is doing. So that's definitely one thing I've noticed, but definitely like consumption of the sport has changed quite a bit. They have like a nice feature on YouTube in the NBA channel where you can watch 10-minute recaps of games, which I think can be a way to keep fans more engaged in a way if you're very diligent about checking in on those and you want to know. But cutting out that time cuts out a lot of the experience and context. So more broadly speaking, I do think for myself, and I think on a cultural level as well, I think our consumption of the game is at a much more shallow level right now compared to how it used to be. You know, you mentioned watching NBA on NBC. I think our watching and consumption was a little more deep back then, at least speaking for myself. You're catching more and more of the context of the games, yet I was younger at the time, so not understanding as much as I understand now.
No, I think that's a good point because not only are you watching these games, you have to watch them in real time. I mean, you catch the highlights, it's too late. And I mean, it's one of those things you might miss the highlights. So you may not even see what's going on. You have to read in the paper the next day. And reading the newspaper, that provides a lot of context, or reading magazines like Sports Illustrated, ESPN, the magazine. You get more context as to what you're watching as to now. Everything's happening in real time. So you can get the context of a game, I don't know, like a minute, just watching the highlights and then a few tweets by Woj or Shams or something. So I think you're right. I think in terms of getting the full picture and appreciating like a full sporting event, I think social media has provided a lot of damage to that. I feel you.
Yeah, especially I think like if I don't catch a game, I know that I don't know the full context of the game,
Yeah.
but I feel like I know what happened when I open up Twitter and I see the Rockets people that I follow and the many NBA experts we've interviewed and others that we follow. I mean, you can get it in 140 characters or less, analysis of what went on in that game or that specific controversial play, whatever's going on. And you kind of feel like you have this understanding, but you might not in reality. It depends on the situation, of course. I mean, some people can make quick, very insightful, pointed analysis like that. But I think not a criticism on the person posting, but just the
Yeah.
medium, as you mentioned, with social media,
Yeah.
kind of limits the context that we're getting.
That makes sense. Let me, if you don't mind me asking, you just watching basketball with your son, does he have the same kind of, and it is, I realize he's still fairly young, so this might change as he gets older, but I'm just always curious about this because I don't have any kids of my own, and I'm always wondering, like like myself, you, and others that have grown up in the '90s, are we a victim of just nostalgia in terms of how we feel about Jordan? Just because I don't know, he's still to this day, I don't know, it's going to sound ridiculous, but he just felt like more than an athlete. And not in the ways of this
Mhm.
admiring just what he does outside of the court, whatever. Just when he's on the court, just there's like this mythical feeling you had about him. And I don't know if that's just because of just our feelings of him as kids, but at the same time, I see journalists in The Last Dance, they have the same feeling and they're grown adults. I mean, they're in their 60s or 70s and they've been covering basketball for years. So I'm just wondering, with your son, just with watching Steph Curry, are those feelings that he has, you think, of this, he's different than the other players? It's more than just his favorite player. Like, it's, you think that's going to be something that's going to stick in his mind, I don't know, like 20, 30 years from now? Just in terms of having that same kind of connection, or do you think it's going to be different?
I think it's going to be different. I think it's going to be its own thing. I think Steph Curry is so darn likable
Yeah,
just as a human being in general that I think there's some carryover there that will be different than what we saw from Michael Jordan. Because I think even when you and I were kids watching Michael Jordan, and he was very professional, well spoken, pointed in his post game interviews and things like that. I just always remember being impressed at his answers and his poise. But there was effective branding with Jordan, and I think there was also the understanding that there was more so. I mean, like you remember the be like Mike, but
yeah,
then also like this guy's invincible. He's 6-0 in the finals. You're never going to beat this guy. He's going to do whatever it takes, that old adage, to beat you. And there's a lot of truth to that too. I mean, he was 6-0 in the finals. You give him that. But I think it's just different marketing, the way his career was spun. And we know, like interviewing guest Johnny Smith, we know that there
yeah,
was a very intentional campaign with regards to that. Um, but it's different where now I think it's trying to make more players like, do you like me? Buy my shoes because I'm likable. I'm this Steph Curry brand. Like it's a little bit different. And I think there is an element too with the Steph Curry thing of just kids understand being able to shoot a jump shot, like some of the things we've seen MJ do, certainly in this generation, like things LeBron has done. I do think there's an element that people realize, well, I'm not 6'9", 250 pounds or whatever with a vertical to jump out the gym like LeBron. And even though the reality is, yeah, my son's not going to be swishing jumpers like Steph Curry, 99% sure of that. Um, it feels a little more attainable to them, I think.
No, that makes sense, and I think three-point shooters were very relatable to me. That's why I have connection with Robert Ory or
Mm,
Steve Kerr or even Derek Fisher. There's a lot of just three-point shooters. I mean, it's more of a specialty, and now it's just commonplace in the game. So, I feel you on that. I want to shift and move. I'm curious what your reaction is going to be. Your answer to this question is going to be, and what is you think is the biggest what if um, in basketball history? Now it could be just personal to you, or I'm curious if you're going to take the more the college route, just
mm,
because there's been a lot more heartbreak. But I'm curious just to see where you take this in terms of kind of the biggest what if moment in your mind, just in basketball history.
mm. This one is so tough. I think my personal one that I would elevate above the rest, and I have a couple that come to mind, but my personal one is, what if the decision doesn't happen? How
Mm.
different do the 2010s and this modern era of basketball look? How different is the conversation around LeBron James? Like, what if he has two titles or three titles instead of the four that he has, but they're all in Cleveland? Like, where is that conversation at that point? Because there's this element of, like, for quote unquote old heads or whatever, um, this continuity with him staying in Cleveland, I think would be appreciated more by past generations and respected more, fairly or unfairly. So I think, in looking at LeBron as an all-time great, that is a huge what if. You also then have the kind of avalanche or snowball effect. Like, if LeBron doesn't go to Miami, does KD go to the Warriors? I think that's a fair question to ask. He said himself, I don't know the direct quote, but basically that LeBron had kind of paved this way. So does this change, affect other changes down the road like that? At some point, you'd have to assume a move like this is made. But with LeBron being the one to make that move, it's it's interesting how much it has impacted just perception of bringing super teams together, and that being directed by players instead of GMs. Although I'm certain when GMs are able to help facilitate it, I mean, Pat Riley helped facilitate the Miami thing. Um, GMs are still going to help and want the best talent they can get.
So, do you think that was bad for the league with the decision and everything that happened? Because I think for a lot of hardcore basketball fans, they take that personal, but yet ratings are up. You have a villain. The NBA finals are more compelling. I mean, you take a look at their rivalry with the Spurs. I mean, no offense with the Spurs, but and it takes two to tango. And I mean, if they're playing like you saw when the Spurs played the Pistons, no one really watched that. I mean, now you have Spurs, a team that people have really hated on for being dull. Now you have this villainous team. You get one of the greatest. You get a fantastic finals, even with Dirk. Like people ragged on Dirk for a long time for his personality, but they're playing the Heat, and all of a sudden they're compelling. I mean, where do you think that is in terms of kind of the feelings on that? Because I sense a lot of hostility towards that whole situation, but yet I think it was great for the league overall in terms of pop this attention.
Yeah, it's definitely nuanced and complex. You can't
Sure.
say it was entirely a good thing or entirely a bad thing. What I'll say, now that we are, what, 13 years at least,
Yeah.
maybe 14 years
Yeah.
off of the decision, I think in some elements it was a little bit empty calories. So like a rush of a lot of eyeballs, clicks. You remember the heat index on the
Hmm.
ESPN website. But in terms of the overall product, to me, from my perspective and what I see, there was a shift in the competitive spirit of the game that changed there. And I have to say, and Justin, you will know, and I'm not shy about my opinions in the time, in the moment, LeBron's a free agent. I was okay with him going to Miami. I
Yeah,
did
me too.
not have the fit that many fans did in Cleveland, and sympathy to you guys, because that was a rough moment losing LeBron in that way. I understand some of that outrage, some of it, like the mini riots or things that happened in the street. That's a
Right.
little overboard
Yeah, agreed.
for me, but I understand. If I were a Cavs fan and that happened, I would be very disappointed by that. Um, so I think there was a shift that happened in that moment. Some of the things, like we've talked about with guests, um, I think was a signal for player empowerment. I don't blame players trying to get the best options for themselves and their families, those types of things. I don't think many people in their heart of hearts would fault players for doing that. And I think it always comes down to this discussion where it's like this is the player's fault or this is the owner's fault, when really this players are making so much money nowadays. I think um some of the movement away from the competitive spirit that you and I grew up with watching in the league is a result of the players just have it so good right now. And that's great for them. The league is in the best place it's ever been financially. With that comes comfort. And with comfort, am I really going to dive for that basketball, dive into the stands the way Dennis Rodman used to, if I'm making 30 plus $1 million, and an injury, in fairness to that player, I mean, an injury could really financially harm you.
Well, that's interesting with motivation because I think we saw the Olympics. I mean, they have plenty of money, but yeah, I think all those guys played their hearts out for gold. So I'm curious. You're right. You're right with players. It's so tough because I think of like the NFL, right? Like nowhere near as powerful as players' union. You can cut at any time. Players are just discarded or whatever in a way more violent sport. And I don't know. I think the effort is still. I think the quality is still good in the NFL and as popular as ever. And even I would say another, I guess, sport that's the athletes are treated worse is MMA, just in terms of the pay and just the risk involved in that. And yet, I think because the whole thing I've heard is like, well, if you pay them more, like you were saying, are they going to try really hard and anything? But I think the level of fights are about the same over the years. And I don't think I don't know if pay is necessarily correlated to that, but I think that is interesting though, because you're right in some aspects. Because we've seen players, especially on I guess worse teams, that they're not going to play hard during the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season. And yet you have a consumer base that you take a family of four. These games are not cheap, and yet you have players that out there not putting out maximum effort. And you're playing a game. I've heard Shaq. I mean, he went in on Rudy Gobert saying he thinks he's just a terrible basketball player and he doesn't try as hard. And you have you know firemen and teachers and nurses that they'll never make that money in their lives, and yet you have these players that, according to Shaq's eyes, you mentioned Ben Simmons too, that are not deserving. So I feel you. I mean, I think I don't know if there's like a direct correlation there, but I think certainly, I think some players have gotten too comfortable with their salaries. I think there's some huge examples of that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not wishing the players any less success or anything like that.
Of course
I
not.
think
Yeah,
there's a natural shift that happens just when you get to that level of wealth. I
sure.
mean, if I had, tomorrow $50 million in my bank account that I do not have anywhere near right now, there's a difference that happens, and hopefully I don't change in terms of what happens. Um, but I could see that being a mechanism where I'm going to be less willing to take risks. I'm going to, kind of safeguard that security a little bit
Yeah.
more. And again, not faulting the players for that. It's great to see the league have that level of success, but there are changes that come with that. And I think some of that is what we're seeing. I don't think it's in a situation where it's necessarily like unsalvageable or something like that. Um, I think as a new generation comes up, as we get past now this like LeBron, KD, Steph era that we've kind of talked about, and we kind of saw this postseason as sort of a first example of that. Um, as we get into a new generation that can put its own mark on this story, there are going to be players out there that want to put their name above LeBron James in the all-time rankings and have that kind of drive. So I think on the other hand, there's always going to be some form of greatness in the league. I just think
Yeah.
right now, competitively, things look different compared to the 90s and the 2000s.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Let's try to get through all these questions.
Sure.
This is my fault. But what do you think? You mentioned the health of basketball. You think is a good point. So, what do you think is the health of basketball overall? I know you have been passionate about like the changes to the game and what's been happening. What is your overall opinions of the product? Because I mean, my opinions I've been vocal, have been very negative.
Yeah.
Based on what happened in the playoffs. Do you share that same sentiment? Are you optimistic? Or what are you feeling like? I mean, along with there's the dollars and cents of the league, but just you as a consumer of the product, especially since we started this podcast in 2020. Like, what's your overall feelings?
Yeah. I think alluded to earlier, I like the many different things that happen on a basketball court. I don't want to watch a game where it's going to be 60 plus 3-point attempts. And if someone has 38% from the field from three, they're going to beat the team with 35% from the field. Like that's just not an interesting
Yeah.
product to me. Now, not every basketball game is like that. There's still a lot of variety you can find in the league, and there are always excellent athletes to watch, things that'll jump out of the screen to you. So that's where NBA can be in a good spot. Long story short, I'm with you. You mentioned like FIBA rules. I don't know if that's the exact answer, but I am somewhat on board with that. I do think there needs to be something done to bring the overall scoring down. I think aesthetically, for our brains, when games are around 100 points per game, I think basketball is kind of in a good or better position in terms of having a nice balance between offense and defense. If you didn't know, this past season, I believe we were above 115 points per game
Wow.
average for
Wow.
every team in the league. Like that's the league wide average of scores per game, which I think is just too much. And it gives a perception, and sometimes it's very real when you watch, that defense either isn't trying hard and putting in the effort, or they're just outmatched by the skill from the 3-point shot and the spacing that's happening right now. So I think, eliminating the corner shot that Kurt Goldsberry mentioned on our show, that could be an option. But I want to see a little bit more inside outside game. Part of the reason I like watching Jokic so much is that you get to see some stuff in the post. Same thing with Şengün. He operates a lot in the post, which is refreshing to see in the modern NBA game. I think that also makes the game more personal, more in your face. You get more dueling between players in a good sense. So I think those are some things I'd want to see. I want to bring back the hand check as well.
Yeah.
Slow the pace down just a little bit.
Yeah. No, I agree. W- we did an episode fully on this about our goat list. So we'll delve into like our full list in a future episode. But has your goat changed in basketball this year? Have you seen any modifications to who's your number one?
No, not at all. The GOAT has not changed as much as people want to make big points on this. Michael Jordan accomplished more in less time than I think any player you could name, you can bring Kareem into that conversation potentially. I think there is a lot of value nowadays with what LeBron's doing, which by the way is amazing. This is not a slight on LeBron, but weighing a counting stat over like a per game average as well as over accolades that have been achieved in terms of individual and team accomplishments, I think is not a good way to approach the GOAT conversation. That doesn't mean that I think LeBron is entirely out of the conversation. I think he's one of the best players to ever do it, certainly. No shame on his name for that. But I do think Michael Jordan is unequivocally the GOAT. And I think it's been that way since 1998 when he hung it up with the Bulls. And I think people should give more shine on his Wizards resume too, because that was
Yeah,
impressive.
it's
I
true.
know, Justin, you're a Bulls fan, so I'm sorry to bring
Ah,
up that he was on the Wizards,
nah, it's all
but
good.
it
Yeah,
was
he
an
did well.
impressive
It was.
time.
Yeah.
I know that the Wizards didn't win a title, but the Wizards making the playoffs with the roster that they had, that's a feather in Jordan's cap.
No, it is. And I want to ask you with LeBron and what we saw him in the Olympics. I keep bringing this up, but do you think that helped or hurt his legacy? Because clearly we saw him show maximum effort in something I have not seen in quite a while. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the Lakers have not just haven't it hasn't been like the Lakers have been at the bottom of the league. They've been in playoff contention. And yeah, we've kind of seen them. We haven't seen this maximum effort LeBron. We haven't seen like, hey, LeBron gave it everything he had and they still lost. So seeing how he performed the Olympics and like you were saying with Jordan, where he has a lot of, I would say, minimal blemishes to his record compared to LeBron. Do you think that's going to hurt LeBron in the his longevity hurts him just due to he's in the league longer? He's more prone to just more negative moments. Do you think Jordan was more efficient in his time in the league?
Oh, 100% more efficient. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, you look at what Jordan accomplished, I believe, in 15 years in the league and 2 of those years being on the Wizards.
yeah,
Yeah, there's no argument in terms of efficiency. And again, this isn't something to like take shots at LeBron or anything. The longevity is impressive, but when you're talking about the GOAT, you do have to stack the achievements, and there is a difference between 6 titles and 4 titles. There is a difference between number of finals MVPs you won. There is a difference between number of scoring titles that you won. You don't necessarily have to be the best scorer of all time to be the GOAT, but when you combine those scoring titles with the number of all defensive team appearances, which also dwarfs many players, including LeBron's all defensive team appearances, there's just so much weight on that scale on the side of Jordan that I can't argue against it. You guys are welcome to put your arguments against what I'm saying in the comments. We welcome the conversation. Um, Look, again, LeBron's amazing. I was a fan of him before he came into the league. I was super impressed by his high school mixtape the first time I
uh,
saw that. I've pulled for him. I'm just not willing to put him over Jordan. And if you look at his last 4 years in the league, he played 71 games last season, which is incredible
yeah,
for his age. The 3 seasons before that, I think the first one he played 47 games and then just over 50 games for the next 2. It's still a good chunk of time, but it's not chunk of time that you want to be playing if you want to see that team in contention. Uh, and that's my doubts in a nutshell with the Lakers. Just to close really quickly for next year, I don't think the Lakers are going to do well. They had the best possible year I think you're going to get out of Anthony Davis and those 71 games from LeBron. I don't see that repeating this next year.
mhm. No, I agree with you. I don't have too much optimism in the Lakers, but it's Lakers faithful. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Last question for you, and I'm very curious, and I have to give you credit, Matt, because I have tossed you into fire with many of the guests, and you have handled it awesomely. And it's not a word, but I think you've done a phenomenal job. And
Thank
just
you.
handling whatever guests I have, what comes out of my brain. So we have a lot of great interviews, tons of great guests. what has been kind of the most memorable interviews that stood out to you just over our 4 years relaunch?
Man, I asked you this same question, so it's
Yeah,
fair game. I know this is such a tough thing
yeah,
to filter down like this, to distill. Um, Shout out to the guests for like coming on our show. I don't think I have ever had a bad time on an interview in the 5 years we've been doing this. It's truly a blessing to get to meet all these people, have these in-depth conversations. It's
yeah,
awesome. I have to mention, a couple interviews that really stand out. One of the first ones in terms of timeline wise on our show that was really just a complete blast from start to finish was when we interviewed Rayan Ali
yeah,
for the NBA Jam book. That was really cool, and just a mix of a lot of awesome things that we've talked about here. I mean, 90s NBA plus arcade video game culture, a game that was, I think, instrumental in building fanhood of the NBA in general in NBA Jam. I mean, an iconic game all time
yeah.
in its own right. Very fun interview, a very cool, down to earth dude. Definitely read NBA Jam, the book, if you get a chance to do that. I think I was in awe both times that we've interviewed Lee Ellis,
Yeah.
who I've been a fan of since listening to the Basketball Jones as they were back in the day. Now currently No Dunks, was just awesome, and you really see, another thing I'll say to the credit of all the guests, it's there's a real human interest here behind the scenes too. Stuff that you guys don't see in like the pre and post production of these interviews, and talking basketball off air with these people too is so cool. So I I just love it. Have to give a shout out to Roosh Williams, who has always been
Yeah.
great, like covering the Rockets, previewing them, has a lot of, I think, in-depth insight also on the behind the scenes of what's going on in front offices and projecting things like that. So shout out to Roosh. He's always been a favorite. And then I want to also give a shout out and mention Larry Farmer, um, an interview that I think you
You did.
guys would still
Yeah.
enjoy to this day, um, who was former head coach of UCLA and also played with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and those iconic UCLA Bruins teams back in the day. Uh, just such a humble, good human being. Um, I was just floored by getting to do that interview and pick his brain for I think a little over 40 minutes on that interview. Was just an honor, and I mean that same honor with just about every single one of our guests that we've had. It's just been a thrill to do it and a pleasure to do it. And Justin, I appreciate you bringing me along for the ride on these excellent interviews and experiences.
No, of course. And I think I know with this iteration, we started during COVID, and I think it was important to us after our initial review of the Last Dance just to have a different basketball show that really one interviews with reporters that I think when we first started, they were at one outlet. Now they're blown up and now they're killing it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And also just providing stories that don't get touched on. I love talking about teams that really the mainstream doesn't really care about. And I think I take pride in us always covering the WNBA. I take pride in us covering just the relationship between the league and cryptocurrency or just other issues that may be under the surface, sneaker culture and just things, what we talked about with Lee Ellis and just explaining how how basketball overall is more than just what you see, just on a Tuesday or a Thursday night. It is truly just a culture that's behind it. And so I just props to you for just going on the ride with me and just being game to talk to all the guest ideas I've had. Cause I'm like, we'll see if Matt likes this person that we're going to talk to next week. So it's just been awesome. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, you just learn in doing a podcast, not even a basketball podcast, but just how
yeah,
cool other people are and how awesome people are. Like it's it's a nice thing to see in life in general when you remove yourself from like social media comments and things like that and just talk to people. It's amazing what you learn and how much you appreciate other people. And I know
Agreed.
that's like really hokey and corny, but I think it's so important in this modern age.
Yeah. Well, it's the power of podcasting, in my opinion, is getting really in-depth conversations. That's why I mean, I'm always in more favor of just a podcast over a late night interview, in terms of like your late night talk show hosts, because you talk to a celebrity, you can really, they'll tell you, most people, when you talk to them and you let their guard down, I mean, they will be vulnerable with you for the most part. They'll be their authentic selves. It might be negative, but you'll get their authentic selves, for the most part, through podcasts. So I think that's why the athlete podcasts have really blown up, and I think they continue to be popular because you get to see different sides of these athletes that they're not going to share with a reporter, but they will share, with their best friend or with it's another athlete because they have that connected bond. So I think this podcasting is really powerful in that way. So.
Totally agree.
I think that's going to wrap us up, with our interview. This was Matt's idea to do this, and this has been awesome. What do you think about this experience? This is kind of your brainchild. So, did it go according to plan, based based on your brainstorming session of this?
I think so, man. I'll give us the pat on the shoulder. I think it's been a good experience, and I wanted our listeners, our longtime listeners, we haven't done something like this yet.
Yeah,
And we conduct a lot of interviews, and our job there is to give a good interview. So it's not injecting ourselves and our opinions into the conversation. I mean, we get some of those in from time to time, but we want to put that appropriate spotlight on the guest. So I think this is a good opportunity, and there's a lot of big picture things you can look back on in both these interviews and see kind of our vision of the game, our what inspires us about the game, and and hopefully a good picture of why both of us love the game ultimately.
yeah, no, totally agree. Matt, thank you for just being my co-host, one of my best friends, and just going on this ride. And cheers for many years more on this journey.
Cheers, my friend. Thanks to you as well.
Yeah, you're
Peace
welcome.
out, everybody.
Yeah. See you later. And again, check out our archives for our past shows. If you have any feedback, hoopsologypod@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.
Peace.